Thank you. That is, for those of you who don't know him, he's really famous for that book, Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life, which is a real takeoff of Carl Jung, and it's very similar to Richard Rohr's Falling Upward, I think, and maybe some other authors, but to me, I consider those all cousins. Is there anybody else that wants to participate in this discussion that I have not called on? Okay, so what I usually like to start with is our 4 questions. We're going to start with, he's a best-selling author. I mean, this guy, everybody reads him. He's coming out of that Jungian tradition. But why do we read James Hollis? Why do we listen to him? He's going to talk about aging and dying. Tell me why you think, all right, I'm listening.
Okay, I'll just start since I'm not muted yet. I found him initially very, very compelling because he's talked about addressing, the fears of abandonment, sloth. I think were what he talked about, and in terms of just in life, repressing symptoms or issues that bother you, and how he explained how they continue to come up in life in louder and louder ways until you listen to them and address them. To me, that just sounded so poetic and so good, and I just feel like it was also gave me a support structure for moving into the second half of life, as well as Richard Rohr. I think a lot of things just it resonated, so I didn't feel so alone or lost. That's it.
So he spoke to the trajectory that you were dealing with, or the crossroads that you were at, but he also gave you a method that made sense to you.
Yes. I was going through a period of a lot of anxiety, and I think probably life, but also just realizing, hey, I'm about to turn 50. I'm getting older. And somehow I found it just very, very meaningful, kind of directional, purposeful, kind of grounding. So yeah, at the time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is the first book I've read of his, I think, at least, more than just scanning something on my shelf. He's remarkably clear for a Jungian.
This is his strength. I feel like he finally makes sense, like complexes finally make sense.
Yes. I mean, that's kind of a joke, right? But it is true. Jungians can be, you've got to read very, very carefully. And this seemed like a little more casual and clear and again, I haven't read the earlier stuff, so maybe this is unusual for him that this later book is clear. I don't mean to diss Jungians. I could identify with that tradition, but
I feel like that's why he's popular. I feel like he's Jungian in an accessible way. He read Carl Jung and then he told us what Carl Jung said, but I think he made it clearer.
You go ahead.
I'll just say, I'm 78 and I was doing fine till like right before 75. And then between 75 and 78, I have all these kind of like maybe existential kinds of questions, anxieties. And he normalized it for me. I mean, it's like, oh, what I'm experiencing is kind of the natural order of things. It's not something to be dealt with and fixed. It's just to be accepted as my new normal and find ways to be comfortable and happy in that. So.
I love that. That's one of my favorite things about Hollis. He's one of those guys saying, I've read everything, I've thought about these things, and I think it's normal to have suffering as part of the human condition. And then you said existential questions. I mean, he really is, to me, when I think about him as Carl Jung plus existentialism, which can sometimes feel a little bit, I'll be curious what you guys think, not as rich as Jung in terms of like transcendental meaning. It can still feel really existential, like almost like hard and make meaning out of life. But I love what you're saying, Sarah, is that he normalizes the way most of us experience our lives. Who else? Or should we move on to, Julie, you have to talk. You love James Hollis. Oh, wait, no, you already said, okay.
And what I like about him is, as you've all pointed out, he does take Jungian concepts and brings them to your everyday life. So you feel like, oh, okay, so it's not just me, so I understand that. So that to me is very important aspect of it. He often talks about the summons of your soul. So he goes deeper and he goes, when you get those callings, you have to listen to them because as someone else pointed out, then you might get ill. So I thought that was very interesting. Walking in shoes that are too small for you, he often mentions that. So don't be afraid to. And when he talks about a bigger life, he doesn't mean, bigger house, bigger car, bit more money. He just talks about really going, knowing who you are and not being afraid of becoming who you are. So that to me is important when he does. He walked the talk. Decided, I guess, in his mid-30s that what he was doing, because he was an academic, he was a professor prior to becoming a Jungian analyst. And then he decided something was going on with him. And I think that's what started this kind of writing for him so he can go back and say, yes, I've gone through changes in my life. My soul was calling, I was not listening, and then I decided to do something about it. So to me, when an author or a writer or, someone has experience, that to me is very useful. So.
Thank you. He's so real. And people, he like when you talk about James Hollis, like the people love him. You hear the affection in their voice for him. He's kind of come off the mountain a little bit. So we've already started to poke into this a little bit, but if we're going to say what would James Hollis, because we've explored the untethered soul, we've explored Ram Dass, what would James Hollis say is the problem? Or what is the problem that he's addressing in this book? I think he's kind of talking about some of our books won't be about the existential problem of the human condition, but I think he is. What does James Hollis, and any of you can answer it, what does he say? This is the problem we are coping with. And I'm curious whether or not that resonated of, yes, that's the problem I'm coping with. Or what's missing? What's part of the struggle of aging and flourishing that he doesn't touch upon? Anybody?
I think he touches on it in similar ways to Ram Dass. I think the concept is similar, but expressed maybe differently. Hollis likes to ask, I'm doing this in service to what? Is it in service to my soul's calling? Is it in service to external pressures or factors? Moving from and here also moving from reactivity to generativity in terms of how we've coped with past trauma. I like that he said here, trauma is as inevitable as breathing. And so it's just, he normalizes it as a part of life, but what are you going to do with it as opposed to getting stuck with it? And I feel like that's a similar message with an untethered soul, with Ram Dass, with Eckhart Tolle. I mean, really, I feel that what they're saying is you don't get stuck with a story. You move beyond that story to, okay, what am I going to do? How am I going to make my life? And what are these, what are the more compelling calls to living a full life that meets the gnawing or the demands of the soul, that to have that internal kind of centering and communication. So that's kind of my take.
Thank you. Who else? I mean, my question here is like, sometimes when I read Ram Dass, I feel like, and maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like I hear more like peace or something. Like the existential angst of Hollis feels a little bit stronger to me. Like this is where I was thinking about Julie B, who's not participating today, of like, is he really a thinker? Is Hollis really saying like the purpose is to deconstruct the false self and take personal authority of our lives? I love what he says about the complexes, but I kind of wonder about, is the journey of the second half of life to take personal authority, or am I misunderstanding what he means when he says that?
He's a bit grim. I mean, this is a more grim view of the world than I find in Jung or in a lot of Jungians. And I was thinking, when I was thinking about, you were asking about the underlying problem, and certainly for him, those childhood wounds that shape us, and I would agree with that. But I also suspect there's something, I don't know, there are other things that are deeper that are in all of us, even without, many childhood wounds. So, and on the other side, I also, we need to take authority. What does he say? We need to shut up, suit up, and show up. Yeah, yeah, we need to do that. We need to do all that. We need to take authority. We need to take responsibility for ourselves, all of those things, for our childhood wounds, for whatever else. But I think I have, and and I suspect it seems that Jung did have a sort of a I don't know, more present sense of the spiritual. I mean, the spiritual isn't something us, but more than us, right? God or a larger life of the spirit or something like that, which I think just means I have sort of an enchanted worldview that's not as grim as his worldview. It may be they both may be equally wrong, but his does strike me as a little grim.
Okay, thank you for that, because if I didn't have his language saying I believe in the soul, I would think I was reading an atheist. And he cites all the atheists. He's citing Camus, he's citing Sartre. I mean, you're like, dude, everybody you're citing is an atheist. And Jung to me feels a little bit more flourishing. But that might have just been my read. And as I was reading him, and I love him, I sometimes think, I don't know how happy this guy is. Like, I'm not sure if he's still just like his sense of like death as being like we're all sort of up all night worried about dying. I'm like, I don't know. I think there's a lot of women in my group that aren't that way, that have connected with something more. But maybe I'm just beating up James Hollis.
I would agree. I felt like I kind of was done reading James Hollis because he talks about a lot of things that are meaningful in terms of gaining that, that agency, reclaiming the agency and your voice in the second half of life, which I found super helpful and just resonated. But there is no talk of finding enthusiasm, joy, the lighter side of life. So it is heavier reading, despite it being so meaningful and so helpful for much of, or at least much of what I've found in life.
Okay, somebody come defend James Hollis. I don't know, because I'm not sure. Yeah, because that's how it feels to me. I mean, he gives us the best methods with examining the complexes. I love his line, like the complex has no imagination. I've never heard anybody say that. I'm like, that is so useful. But has he found? I mean, he normalizes suffering in a way that makes us think, okay, it's not just me that struggles throughout the journey. But then I also think, I don't know if you found something that I'm aspiring to. I get existential meaning, but I feel like sometimes I read people who feel a little bit more at peace in the present moment, as Becca was saying.
I think it's because he's had a lot of personal suffering himself. So I think he hasn't, you know how some people, he lost his son. I think his son was in his early 40s, so he had to deal with the passing of a child, which is difficult. He talks about his wife, though, so you'll hear him talk about his wife, who's an artist, so that which is interesting. But I think you know how some people just have personalities that are a little bit more morose, and I think that's what comes through to him. And I also believe, and I'm not defending him, there's so many other people that will do positive psychology, for example. So he probably figures he doesn't need to do that. He's just going to call it as it is. And that's how he sees the world. And then he takes how Jung sees the world. And then I guess he um, normalizes it and makes sure that we can understand. Because if you start reading Jung, sometimes you go, okay, what's he trying to say? Where are we going with this? It's not easy. So that's the part, because I am always interested in what Jung has to say, but I find Hollis can take it and give it to us. And I think he's fulfilling a specific need or niche in society. He doesn't go the joy way. He doesn't go like other people will do that. So I think he just has found an area. But I found in some of his other books, I found them to be repetitive. Whereas, like the concepts, and I've listened to him on interviews, and I thought, well, I've already read that. You've already said this. There was not that much new. I found this one was written more with wisdom as opposed to just young. I thought, he's 85. He's suffered in the past 5 years, lots of treatment. He's still seeing his patients. And I found this book, to me, of all his books, is the one I prefer because I found there was more of a humanity to it. But as I said, he's filled a void in society and he's keeping kind of in that niche. He doesn't go too much beyond that. That's my point of view, anyways.
Thank you, Julie D. I think that's super helpful and repeats that thing of like, he's so authentic, he's so real. He won't sit up on the mountain and say, I've figured it all out. He's saying, that first paragraph that some people were mentioning at the beginning of all of the legitimate suffering, which was his physical suffering, has come up in and it's useful. Who else? Kind of like, does what he say the problem of the human condition is, did it feel like, yeah, that's my problem? Or do you feel like it wasn't a match?
Well, I find it in many of the chapters of this book, I thought, oh yeah, that's true. Like when he talks about, social media or when he talks about creativity and I thought, yeah, yeah, that suits me. Especially if you come from a specific background where joy was difficult to attain, then you think, yeah, yeah. I understand though with someone else said, was it Lisa that said, there's not much joy. And that's true. So he's a little bit more, you have to be in a specific frame of mind to read him. You can't be looking, you have to know who you're reading and what's going to come out of it. I think you take this book and then you absorb some of the writing and some of the wisdom, and then you take another book and then you complement them together. And I think that will give you maybe more of a balanced view of what you're looking for.
Thank you, Julie D. Anybody else want to speak to that? Or we can also just kind of dive into it. We've already been moving around in that space of what is his method? What does James Hollis tell us? Okay, this is what you guys need to do. Everybody go do your homework. This is what it is. What are you supposed to do in order to live well and be well?
Deal with the reality of your pain.
But
Find your
how? But how? How do I deal with the reality of my pain, according to James
by
Hollis?
moving toward it, by facing it, by interrogating it, by not looking for easy answers. And by the way, it's not that I actually find that all bracing and helpful. I just then tend to have this other enchanted overlay over all of it. And I'm sort of mocking myself by saying enchanted, but still probably it looks like that from the outside. But I was thinking that line he has, what supports us when nothing supports us, which comes up a lot. And I think it's a great question to ask because we rely on a lot of things that don't ultimately, right? That aren't ultimately. But I always also have this worldview where there's never a time when nothing supports us. But that's okay because the question still holds. But no, I think it's facing that it's facing the grimness and it's facing the pain and interrogating it, moving toward it.
Yeah, a big sense of taking responsibility, which I think is probably what resonates for you. Taking responsibility for your life. He is such a good voice in that. I mean, he's speaking against some of the dominant trauma narratives that are out there right now, taking responsibility for your stories. Now, just to this is where I feel like we could bridge the divide between taking responsibility and really speaking to the suffering of the human condition. I don't know if you guys picked up a couple of times, he referred to prayer and mantra as distractions. And at one point even said, I wouldn't say that they're necessarily harmful, but and I was like, okay, I feel like some of the women I work with might say that prayer and mantra is not harmful, but maybe actually practically useful. And so that was just sometimes where I'm like, what do you believe, guy?
Jennifer, I think we're at a stage in our lives where when you read a book or with anything else in life, you take what works for you. And, if I think prayer is important to me and James Hollis says, oh, I'll say, well, good, that's what you think. But I don't have to listen to everything you say. There's some messages in your writing that I can take, but it doesn't mean that I will, be some disciple that I will follow you no matter what. No, I think we come to a stage in our lives where we have to pick and choose.
Yeah.
And he does keep asking what supports us when nothing supports us. And you start thinking, that's a very good question. So then you start looking at your daily life, your practical life. And for me, what's very important is what's meaningful. So I think he's often pushing us. And I think that's where your summons, the summons of your soul, your callings, it's what's meaningful for you. And then there's another book he talks about some of his patients coming in, and one woman said, well, I'm trying to find meaning in my life, and I can't find meaning in my life. All I want to do is dance. And he said, so go and dance. That's what's going to give
Beautiful.
to your life. So I think you take from him what works for you. I think it's very important. He's also very, you can tell he's a professor because there's a lot of references, literary references, which I like personally. But anyway, so he's often talking about different people. But from reading James Hollis over the years, I take what works for me and I complement him with other, authors. And I think we are at a phase in our lives where we can do that.
Yeah, you're reading with discernment. And I think that you brought us around to that a session or two ago when you were talking about it is ourselves in conversation with these texts. Or that was my interpretation of what you said. And that is so important of taking it's or as 12 steppers will say, take what you like and leave the rest. And I think he even makes some references to the 12 steps. I sometimes also want to push him into conversation with some of the other books we've read, like because, kind of trying to build the muscle that you're talking about, Julie, of like, oh, I'm reading James Hollis, and so now I'm supposed to do this. But I've lost touch with something that I learned from Ram Dass about the present moment. But I love hearing you guys talk about it, though. But reading with discernment feels like an important muscle that we're building. What are the other methods? I mean, he talks about, like I said, what's so good about him is I think his unpacking of the complex. Because whenever you're studying Jungian stuff, everybody's like, I don't really understand the complex. And if you read James Hollis, he's finally the person who explained it better than Jung. And then he kind of gets into the fact that our dreams are meaningful communications from the unconscious. So those are his methods. As we compare them to what is Ram Dass's method, what is Michael Singer's method, what are these people offering us about how to be well? He's really saying, pay attention to your stories and pay attention to your dreams and take responsibility for your life and recognize that suffering is normal. Does that sound right, or am I missing anything, Sarah?
I'm good with that. I appreciated that I think he conveyed there's a tension to life. There's always a tension to life, and that tension changes as you get older. And I have spent a lot of my life reading books, taking classes, doing things, trying to find the answer to comfort or certainty around certain issues. And I felt like his message was, stop it. There is,
Beautiful. Yeah, ambiguity.
Yeah, you don't have to be in comfort. You don't have to find this certainty. Just let go and relax in it. Don't keep fighting it, because it's in the fighting that the tension comes. And probably the tension is the irritant underneath most of the things in our life.
I like the way you said that, because it's sort of like we've read Don't Be Resistant in other texts, but they don't really unpack it. And the way you just said it, Sarah, it's like, yeah, don't be resistant. Tolerate the inherent tension and ambiguity of the lived experience. And that's what James Hollis is adding, maybe, at least for me. Lisa, were you going to say something?
Just that he calls for, I think, for us to be authentic. And realizing when, with that question, like, what am I doing this in service to? Like, is it a need for control, which again brings it to you're not being in the present moment, which is what I find that kind of overlaps with Ram Dass, and other spiritual authors. He does say that the need for control is the antithesis of growth. So, in that sense, I think he's focusing on be authentic, be present. What is it? What is your true soul calling? Why are you doing this? Is it a reaction? Is it I feel like part of that is like what y'all already said. He urges us to take responsibility, but also recognizing what is our belief? What is our story behind how we're seeing things, how we're choosing to see things, maybe in a way that increases our suffering and our resistance. So it brings it back to you have to let go of that as well, which I think he doesn't necessarily say that in words, but I feel like that's the ultimate, it kind of, to me, that's what it means, which makes it similar to other authors that y'all have mentioned.
Yeah, he's really into actually digging into our old stories, which I love. And I also like the fact that he uses the word stories as opposed to like complexes and some of those Jungian terms that you feel like, am I stoned? Like what happened? But he using that word stories to me is helpful, and I lost my train of thought, so I'll stop there.
It's very interesting when he says, if you could have dinner with anybody in your life, then he starts talking about different people, and then he says, my 10-year-old self. So for me, when I was reading that, because I've read other authors, others, and it was another way, just for me, it was very much about trauma. So he just chooses a different way to talk about trauma. Because if you read The Body Keeps a Score, they're going to go and talk about, CPTSD or PTSD or whatever. And these are some of the, and he talks about that too. And then he talks about what would I say to my 10-year-old self? So for me, it goes back to a lot of other writers who will talk about our inner child. So he also brings the inner child into a lot of our decisions. So there is a child within us. Maybe that's where our big self, S for self is. And then we need to uncover that. So the rest is a lot of stuff out there, but go back inside and see what that 10-year-old self, because if you read, I don't know, they'll say we all need to adapt because we've all had difficult situations in our lives and when we were children, blah, blah, blah. And to me, that's when I was reading, I thought, oh my gosh, he's talking about trauma. He's talking about he's talking about his inner child. He's talking about what's within all of us. And when he talks about having agency, he also talks about going and finding out what that authentic 10-year-old was supposed to be before that authentic 10-year-old had to adapt to life and maybe became someone different because of the life situation that 10-year-old was living. So to me, that's where the summons comes from. That's where the calling comes from. And I thought that was for me, that was a very interesting. And I also like his premise about what's the other famous book? The Road Less Taken. What was the name of that book? Anyways, where when you read that book, that's an older book, I guess a 20 some
That
year
was
old.
Scott Peck's The
That's,
Road
Less
Less Traveled.
traveled. Yeah.
there you go. Thank you very much, Marie. The Road Less Travel. And then when you read the beginning of that book, the first thing is life is hard. And we are under the assumption, maybe not, maybe not in the past couple of years, but our lives should not be that difficult. It's like we have this illusion that life should always be easy, that happiness should always be there. And that's not reality for me. So I find that's where he's has a more sober approach. And he does tell you, when he on his chapter on happiness, he said, maybe you should go get some meaning. Maybe from meaningful actions, you will find some happy moments, but it's not our way of being. It's not our I don't think right is the right word here, but it's not, happiness is not a given. So I found that. So when he talks about, go back, pay attention, take agency, find something that's meaningful, then you will have some happy moments. But it's not a birthright to be always happy. And I find you read about positive psychology, you read about this person and the 10 steps to be happy, and so I find for me anyways, he's more realistic. But that's my point of view.
I think like you're touching on a few important things. Like I actually had a breakthrough as you're explaining something. But I think people love Hollis because he's mirroring us.
Yes.
You read an author and you think, oh my God, you're like floating around on a cloud, and I'm like throwing up because this thing happened in my life and I'm really sad or I'm struggling. But I think that just for me, that was so helpful that what you said is I have consistently struggled with James Hollis also in the second half of life, because I feel like he starts, as I've understood it until you said this, I understood it as like, it feels like he's suggesting that the first half of life is some sort of error, this false self,
Yeah.
that I want to go interview my earlier self and put him on the right track. And I just tend to believe in the purposefulness of the whole journey. But I think when you said, no, 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 it's you replugging into that inner child. It's you replugging into that intuitive early self that was here to do something. That
Mhm.
feels like a nice reframe for me of some place that I was really stuck with Hollis. So thank you so much.
And I agree, because I don't think he says that the first half. I think the first half is you're experiencing, because of you had to adapt, because you had to cope, because of different things. You're not sure. You're young, and if you read Eric Erickson and all his stages, the first part of your life is all about success and proving myself, and then you get to a point where you go, am I living my life or am I living someone else's life? And I find that's when he talks about going back to my 10-year-old child. He said, I would love to talk to my 10-year-old child. He says, because then you realize whose life was I living? My parents' expectations, what society thinks that I should be doing. You know, you get all these messages constantly. So I think the first part of our life, the way I've seen it with him, is you're experiencing. And that's why I tell my kids, go ahead, try, experience. And then you go back, you get to be a bit older, maybe you're a parent, maybe you're caregiving, maybe whatever. And then you start thinking about, whoa, I have less, you know, ahead than I had before. And then I start thinking about who I am. And I think those inner child summons come back up. And then you go, who was I supposed to be if I did not have to, like Gabor Mate talks about this all the time, who I had to lose my authentic self in order to adapt. And I find that's what James Hollis says. So your first part of your life. And then the second part is, okay, so you've done all this, now uncover who you really are. That's the way I see it. Anyways.
And in that way, part of what I'm sorry, go ahead, Valerie.
I think in listening to everything you said, Julie, about the first part of our life and now this part of our life, I guess my thinking of his philosophy and and I run it through myself, we don't know a whole lot about life when we're kids because we are learning and adapting, and we have all the society constructs and the family constructs and the church, everything thrown at us. But some of us, did have a lot of trauma in our early childhood. So coming to terms with who we are as we age, for me personally, it's been a lot of exploration of who I am now and where is my sense of self? What is my sense of self in the realm of, what Hollis has talked about, what we read about with Ram Dass and, the untethered soul. And I've already started on the estrangement book. And I don't know about y'all, but when I read, I filter it through, obviously, my own sense of self and life's expectations and life's experiences. But again, I just kind of run it through like a sieve and collect what is pertinent to me and toss out what's not. And I think wisdom, just the wisdom of living, helps us be where we are today. And I didn't really get when he said, go back and talk to your 10-year-old self and blah, blah, blah. My 10-year-old self, she had no clue what was going on in life. So I'd be like, forget it. But anyway, I feel like I'm just rambling. I'm just taking it all in what you're saying. And the word wisdom just keeps coming to my mind.
Thank you so much, Val. Yeah. And it is interesting how this is why I like discerning, like, what do we discern as method is? Because I think between the three of us, we had different experiences with that talking to the child part. But Becca, you were also going to say something.
So I think part of his method is, so that line, if we wish to live fully, it's not happiness that's the goal, but to be consumed by that which we have come to love. Happiness as a goal is too small. What's interesting about that is he's sort of, he's dissing happiness, but he's also pointing back to, I don't know, being consumed by what you love. I think Aristotle, Aquinas, any number of other people would think that is happiness. That is, flourishing, eudaimonia, right? That's what that's about, is about being consumed by that which, by what you love and living well. So in some ways he's, I don't know, he's countering a superficial notion of happiness, but the method that he's giving, that is finding what you love, finding your true self and what you love and being consumed by that, is actually a pretty classic idea of what it means to be a person with a flourishing life, a person who is happy.
One more thing before I shut up. I take because he's male and we're female, because Ram Dass is male and we're female, and Michael Singer was male and we're female. I often think, let's read a female version of these people just because we're so different as females. So just
Very
little-
important point. I don't know who is running this book club, but she needs to get a hold of some female authors. Okay,
Now,
I actually heard some names that I think I added up one or two, and may have been from maybe from Julie, but yes, and you mentioned one to me that I love that it's in my book, Val. So we will definitely talk about that. It's very, very important. As we kind of continue to wrap up, and you guys can talk about whatever you want, but I want to say, like, what is most useful from James Hollis? He really is speaking to the aging aspects of life, but that's one of the things that we're trying to do is we're going to read books and we're going to say, you know, how does this relate to aging as an older woman, kind of running off of what you're saying, Val? What was most useful? What do we take away that we think, okay, this is what we need to learn as we walk through the last decades of life from James Hollis? And maybe we've covered a lot of it now, but I want to make sure we highlight
I'll
it.
speak to that again.
Okay, what's useful? What is the most useful thing? Yeah.
Okay, the most useful thing for me is, again, what goes through, what I sift through, and what comes out on top is we have to be who we are and accept where we are in our lives, and that we're aging and getting older, and not listen to so many other people who say, here's how you live when you're old. Listen to ourselves.
Beautiful. Thank you. Who else has something? What did they find most useful from Hollis?
Despite being a male author, I feel that he gives some resounding punches to the patriarchy and giving case examples of women that he's seen who've never been used to, like, what do I want in life? What do I need? But because they're so busy serving. And so to me, that resonates with kind of, you know, my family of upbringing. It makes me think a lot, which makes me also try to discern where is that story behind my resentments, and what do I need to do? How do I step out of it? And again, it's like, how am I authentic? Who am I when you've lived a life where your agency was subsumed to whatever was needed, you know, to situation. I think, and maybe it's because a woman, but I feel like that's harder for a woman because of the social construct around it, where we are always, you know, secondary and supportive. We feel a supportive role and a nourishing role as opposed to a one of authority. I loved his story. He, you know, despite not being very, you know, theistic, he brings up the story of Job in the Bible and about his suffering. But he does say that, you know, how Job's belief system is shattered because of his experience of having a communication with God. And I love how he says, so to me, I'm like, so that belief is a cushion that kind of supports you and gives you agency in life. He even says that. And so that makes me always question, well, what is that belief system that we grow up with that with so much certainty gives men more agency than women? Like, what is my belief system? So it's interesting because we do grow up with a belief system telling us, you know, maybe not you in particular, but if you look at women around the world, you know, for you to be quiet, for you to serve, for you to be more into the domestic arts or more into the nourishing or helpful serving arts. That to me triggers just a lot of activity inside. And but I appreciate that he brings it up. He also brought up the Malleolum Maleficarum, the you know, the book for how to find and identify witches, to burn them, you know. I feel like he's very supportive of women in the end. So I wanted to say that.
Thank you. Yeah, in defense of him, you're right. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah. A lived experience as a man, but probably a man who's listened to a lot of women as a therapist over the years. Thank you, Lisa.
He was probably a woman in a prior life.
No doubt. Who else? What was most useful to you?
I just, from my perspective, because at the beginning he's talking about all his treatments and his cancer and this and this and that, and he still takes time to see his patients, clients, whatever you call them, and he still takes time. He doesn't let his disease or his illness or take over his life. And I found that as you're aging is very important. So for me, he almost strikes the fact that he's writing a book at 85 is kind of very interesting, and he's been quite ill. But he says, my patients, my clients, they nourish me. So, and you know, we go back to what we said, being consumed by what you love. To me, that's a way to get meaning in your life. And obviously, he's consumed by wanting to help others. And I find that comes across in his writing, more so in this book than in the others. So I find, you know, and I, like a lot of other authors, I find they get like something like a question, their own question existentielle, you know, question them for their own existence. And they write about it. And I find that's what he's often done. He arrives at midlife and he's thinking, what's going on here? I'm going to write about it. You know, I've studied Jung, I'm going to write about it so that other people can identify. And I find that's what he's doing with this book. This is what's happening. This is where we're going. You know, he does mention at one point, well, you know, we're all going to go to the same spot. So, you know, so it's how you choose to live between now and your time of death. You know, it's that's where you have agency. And he's doing what he loves, and he's finding a balance between being ill and still being capable of helping others. And to me, that was very important.
Beautiful. Yeah, he really, I think he even explicitly said what you're mentioning is, you know, to serve, you know. And I think that you're teasing out something important. And maybe somebody else it was to dance. But for him, it was to serve. And that's when he's saying, find what you love and let it kill you. But it's going to be unique message from your 10-year-old soul self. Yeah, that feels like what's kind of coming together of like what his thing is. And I appreciate you guys talking about this so much. Really opens it up. And when you say that he's writing from this lived experience, that's what I imagine you guys are doing in this group. Because Jung was so good in the tradition of just writing, even if he wasn't finished with his theory. And there takes a lot of courage to put yourself out there, you know, when you're like, I'm still figuring it out. And I love that that's what I think we're doing in this group too. So who else thinks this is what was most useful to me about Hollis's book?
What I liked was that we're all asking the questions, not just me. But guess what? I don't need to have the answer. I think it's important to have the question and see how it's working for me, but I don't have to get stuck on that answer. And then I did love about him saying, follow your passion. And in the second half of my life, that's what I have done, you know, in terms of leaving New York and abandoning that East Coast structure. And don't get me wrong, I'm here now because I did have emergency surgery in New York because that's where I could get it done. But for me, it's the West and the indigenous people and working with the reservation that kind of gives me the support, that other mental support that I don't always get on the East Coast. So anyhow.
Thank you, Marie. Who else? Something that's useful. And I'll be boarding my flight in about 7 minutes. So I thank you guys for your patience.
Yeah, I mean that quote that I did before that connects with things people were saying. That is, well, first of all, finding what seizes your imagination and what you'd be willing to suffer for, and then being consumed by that which you have come to love. I mean, that is great advice for any age, but certainly at the last. And
Right.
and this willing, you're being consumed anyway. So I will also say that Trump and the American electorate chapter was very helpful, and that this idea drawing on Mencken that the presidency can become a mirror of the soul of a people. I read that and I found it was it was a helpful framing for the craziness that's happening. But I think that being consumed by what you love is what I take with me.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Becca. And yes, I forgot to mention at the very beginning of the meeting before I started recording and everybody was in here, I suggested that we wouldn't pack into the chapter 6 because I felt like we could do a whole meeting on that. Since we're talking about aging and dying, I thought if we start talking about the divided electorate, we'd be going for 2 hours. And we can do that if somebody wants to do that. But yeah, it was him talking about the divided self, the divided nation. So thank you. Who else on what they loved, what was useful? If that's kind of it, we might wrap up. We had a lot of people here today that were listening, which I love. See I feel confused about who's participating in the meeting and who's not participating in the meeting. So I think I might just have you raise your hands, or if you had something else you wanted to say, Julie.
Oh, no, thank you for
Oh,
doing this. Thank you for doing this at the airport too, and under difficult circumstances, That's all I
thank
wanted
you.
to say. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate that so much. I was just so embarrassed, is actually what I felt. I had everything canceled and I was doing it. And then many of you know you got an ice storm in DFW. So everything was canceled. And then I had to start all over and cancel my whole week. And so I was like, I'm not pushing this out another week. I'm going to do it at the airport. So thank you for your patience. And I'll be more focused in our next meeting. But I was so excited to talk about Hollis with you guys. So we're going to be doing rules of estrangement next week. I'm not sure how many people find that interesting. I'm a therapist. I find it super interesting. It probably won't be as deep, but some sort of last thoughts before we wrap up today. Or if that's it, then we'll call it a wrap, and maybe I'll be seated in a nice snowy cabin in the woods next time I see you, not on the floor of DFW. So, okay. Thank you all. Reading rules of estrangement next week, and hope to see you guys here.